The crystal chandelier above us glowed like warm honey, casting soft golden light across smiling faces and raised glasses. I stood beside my daughter, Lauren, holding a champagne flute in one trembling hand, trying to steady my breath as laughter echoed through the grand ballroom of the old Savannah mansion. The air smelled faintly of roses and polished wood, and for a moment, everything felt exactly the way I had dreamed it would be. Lauren leaned into Victor, her fingers wrapped around his arm, her smile wide and glowing. Cameras flashed. Guests clapped. Someone called for me to say a few words, and I lifted my glass, my heart swelling with pride. After all the years of struggle, of raising her alone after her father died, this moment felt like proof that everything I had sacrificed had been worth it. Then the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough for me to feel it before I saw him. Thomas stood in the doorway. My brother hadn't been expected. Not tonight. Not after months of silence and work assignments he never explained. He wore a dark suit, his posture straight, his eyes scanning the room like he was reading every face, every movement, every exit, even from across the ballroom. His presence carried weight. Conversation softened. People noticed him the way they always did, and with curiosity and quiet respect. He walked toward me slowly, not smiling, not celebrating. Something inside me tightened. I lowered my glass slightly, still smiling for the guests, still pretending everything was perfect. When he reached me, he didn't greet Lauren. He didn't congratulate Victor. He leaned close, so close I could feel his breath against my ear. His voice was barely more than air. "Don't sign anything he gives you." The words slid into me like ice water. My smile froze mid-expression. My fingers tightened around the glass until I thought it might shatter in my hand. A chill moved down my spine so fast it stole the warmth from my chest. I didn't turn toward him. I didn't ask questions. I didn't dare move. Before I could react, Thomas stepped back, his face calm again, unreadable, as if he had never spoken at all. And I was left standing there, smiling into the light, pretending nothing had changed, even though everything suddenly had. I cleared my throat and lifted my glass again, forcing myself to speak before anyone noticed the panic tightening in my chest. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "This means more to me than I can put into words." Faces turned toward me. Friends. Family. People who had watched Lauren grow up from a shy little girl into the confident woman standing beside me now. I focused on her smile, bright, hopeful, filled with love, and tried to anchor myself there instead of in Thomas's whisper. I raised Lauren on my own. I continued, my voice warming as memories flooded in. After her father passed, there were nights I didn't know how we'd make it, but somehow we did. And tonight, seeing her this happy, standing beside someone she loves, makes every struggle feel worthwhile. Applause rippled through the room. Lauren squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with emotion. Victor smiled at me, his expression polished and reassuring. The kind of smile that had charmed nearly everyone in the room since the moment he entered our lives. He looked perfect, tall, well-dressed, confident in a way that made people trust him without question. I watched him shake hands with one of the guests, laughing at something they said, nodding with easy confidence. People leaned toward him when he spoke, as if drawn in by his certainty. And for a moment, I almost convinced myself that Thomas had overreacted. Almost. Then I noticed something small. So small no one else seemed to see it. Victor glanced at his watch, not casually, but quickly, like he was tracking time. His eyes shifted toward Lauren, and he gave her a subtle nod. She responded just as quietly, her fingers tightening around her purse strap. A silent exchange. Private. Intentional. My pulse quickened. The music swelled again. Soft jazz drifting through the ballroom as waiters carried trays of sparkling drinks past clusters of guests. Laughter rose and fell in waves. Everything looked festive, joyful, safe. But inside me, something had shifted. Thomas didn't give warnings lightly. He never had. My brother had spent years working cases he rarely spoke about. Cases that left shadows in his eyes even when he tried to hide them. If he whispered a warning like that, at my daughter's engagement party of all places, it meant something was wrong. Deeply wrong. I scanned the room until I found him again. Thomas stood near the back wall now, arms crossed loosely. Watching everything, not celebrating, not drinking. Observing. His gaze moved from Victor to Lauren, then briefly to me. Our eyes met. And in that moment, he gave the smallest movement of his head. A slow, deliberate shake. Not dramatic, not obvious, but unmistakable. My breath caught. I turned my attention back toward Lauren just in time to see Victor guiding her gently toward a side table near the gift display. He spoke quietly, his voice too low to hear over the music. Lauren nodded and reached into his jacket pocket when he gestured. He handed her a sealed envelope. Plain, white, unremarkable. Except for the way she handled it. She looked around quickly, not panicked, but cautious, before slipping the envelope into her purse. The motion was fast. Practiced. Like she didn't want anyone noticing. Like she didn't want me noticing. But I had... And suddenly, Thomas's whisper echoed in my mind again. Louder this time. Heavier. Don't sign anything he gives you. I forced myself to keep smiling as another guest approached to congratulate me. I nodded politely, responded when spoken to, laughed when expected. But every sound felt distant now, muffled beneath the pounding of my own heartbeat. Victor returned to my side minutes later, his smile warm and attentive. "Everything okay?" he asked smoothly. "You look a little pale." His voice was gentle, concerned, almost convincing. I met his eyes, searching for something, anything, that might confirm or deny the fear building inside me. "I'm fine," I replied, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. Across the room, Thomas watched us, still silent, still waiting. And as Lauren laughed beside Victor, unaware of the storm building beneath the surface, I realized something I didn't want to admit. That envelope hadn't been nothing, and whatever was inside it had already started changing everything. Morning light slipped through the tall front windows of my antique shop, turning dust into floating gold. Normally, that sight comforted me. It reminded me of quiet mornings after Lauren left for school years ago, when I would open the shop alone and let the silence settle around me like a blanket. But that morning, silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy. I hadn't slept more than a few minutes all night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Thomas's voice again, low and urgent in my ear. "Don't sign anything he gives you." The words repeated themselves like a clock ticking inside my head. Even now, standing with the shop key in my hand, I felt the same cold knot tightening in my chest. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of polished wood and old paper. The antique clocks along the far wall ticked steadily, their rhythm usually comforting. Today, each tick sounded louder than usual, sharper, like a warning counting down. Something was wrong. I felt it before I saw it. The small office light in the back was already on. I froze in the middle of the shop floor. Lauren never arrived early. She hated mornings. Always had. Even as a child. She'd linger in bed until the last possible minute. Seeing that light burning before I'd even opened the doors sent a ripple of unease down my spine. I walked toward the office slowly, my footsteps softer than usual against the wooden floor. As I reached the doorway, I saw her. Lauren sat at the desk, her back slightly hunched, papers spread in front of her. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and there were faint shadows beneath her eyes, as if she hadn't slept much either. A pen rested in her hand. When she noticed me standing there, she flinched. Just slightly, but enough. "Oh," she said quickly, straightening in her chair. "You're early?" I forced a small smile. "So are you—" She gathered the papers into a loose stack, her movements quick and practiced, like she didn't want me seeing what was there. "What are you working on this early?" I asked, keeping my voice light. Just paperwork, she replied, not meeting my eyes. Nothing important. Nothing important. Yet the way she shielded those papers with her hand made my stomach twist. I stepped further into the room, pretending to busy myself with a box of receipts near the desk. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of the top page. My name, printed in bold letters. Margaret Doyle. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't an invoice. It wasn't a supplier form. It looked formal, structured, legal. Lauren, I said carefully. Turning toward her, why is my name on that? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pen. It's just protection paperwork, she said quickly. Victor suggested we organize everything before the wedding. You know, just to be safe. Safe. That word didn't comfort me the way she thought it would. Protection from what? I asked. She sighed, as if I were the one being difficult. It's normal. Mom, people do this all the time. Victor just wants to make sure everything is structured properly. He thinks the shop could grow, maybe expand into more locations. Her words hit me harder than I expected. Expand the shop. This little store wasn't just a business. It was the last thing my husband had built with his own hands before he died. Every shelf, every cabinet, every brass handle carried a memory. The idea of turning it into something larger, something corporate, made my chest tighten. Why does expansion require paperwork with my name on it? I asked quietly. Lauren shifted in her chair. He believes in your future. Mom, she said. In us. I watched her carefully. She still wasn't looking at me. That alone told me something was wrong. I leaned slightly closer to the desk, pretending to straighten a stack of papers nearby. This time, I saw more clearly. Property transfer authorization. The words blurred for a moment as my heart began pounding in my ears. Lauren, I said slowly. Did you read all of this? Of course I did, she replied quickly. Too quickly. My eyes moved down the page. And then I saw it. At the bottom, a signature. My signature, or something that looked dangerously close to it. The same slanted M, the same looping D, except I hadn't signed anything. My fingers went cold. I reached for the paper before she could stop me, lifting it carefully into my hands. This? My voice came out softer than I expected. When did I sign this? Lauren's face went pale. You didn't, she admitted after a long pause. It's just a draft copy. A draft copy, with my forged signature already printed on it. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I stared at the signature again, comparing it in my mind to the dozens I'd written over the years. Something about the shape was wrong, too stiff, too deliberate. Someone had practiced my name. Lauren, I whispered. Who gave you this? Victor, she answered. Her voice defensive now. He said it's standard practice. Lawyers prepare documents in advance all the time. Standard practice. Nothing about this felt standard. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. The sound startled both of us. I pulled it out with unsteady fingers. A message from Thomas. Just one line. Do not give him access to your property. My heart slammed against my ribs. 2 warnings now. 2 separate moments pointing in the same direction. I looked back down at the document in my hand. My name. Forged. Prepared. Ready? Did you sign anything already? I asked quietly. Lauren hesitated again. Yes, she admitted at last. Preliminary forms. Nothing final. The words landed like stones. Preliminary forms meant the process had already started. You should trust him, she added, her voice rising. Victor knows what he's doing. You always assume the worst about people. This isn't about assuming, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This is about understanding what you're signing. Her expression hardened. You don't trust anyone, she snapped. That's the problem. Pain flickered through me, sharp and unexpected. Not fear this time. Heartbreak. I trust you, I said softly. That's why I'm asking. She shook her head. You're overreacting. Overreacting. I stared down at the page again, reading the fine print at the bottom, the section so small most people would skim past it. And there it was. A single line that made my blood run cold. Full property control upon marriage. Not shared control. Not temporary management. Full control. Transferred. Away from me. I lowered the paper slowly, my hands trembling. This wasn't protection. This was preparation. And whatever Victor was planning had already begun. The shop felt too quiet after Lauren left. The bell above the front door had barely finished ringing when the silence settled in. Thick and suffocating. I stood behind the counter with the document still clutched in my hands, staring at the words that had turned my stomach cold. Full property control upon marriage. I read the line again, slower this time, hoping I had misunderstood it the first dozen times. But the words didn't change. They sat there on the page, permanent and deliberate, waiting for a signature that would hand over everything I had built, everything my husband had left behind. My fingers tightened around the paper. I tried to breathe, but my lungs felt tight, like the air inside the shop had grown thinner. I didn't remember giving Victor access to any of our records. I didn't remember approving drafts, or sharing details about the property, or discussing insurance policies with anyone but my late husband years ago. Yet somehow, he knew too much. That thought settled into my chest like a stone. I walked toward the back office and opened the metal filing cabinet where I kept the original property deeds. The drawers slid open with a familiar metallic scrape, but the comfort I usually found in routine was gone. Instead, there was tension, fear. I pulled out the thick folder labeled Property, Main Store, and set it on the desk. My hands moved carefully, almost reverently, flipping through the documents one by one. Something was off. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just wrong. The papers weren't stacked in the same order I always kept them. The warranty deed that should have been on top was tucked halfway down the pile. The insurance records were slightly misaligned. Tiny changes. But I noticed them. I always noticed them. Someone had touched these files. Someone had opened this cabinet. The realization sent a cold wave through my body. I leaned against the desk, trying to steady myself, when another memory rose uninvited, sharp and vivid, like a photograph being held up to the light. 6 months earlier, Lauren had come home late one evening, her face tight with worry. She had been pacing the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, her voice hushed but strained. Her company had announced layoffs, and she feared her position might be next. That was the first time she mentioned Victor. They had met at a charity event downtown, some fundraiser hosted by one of the larger real estate firms in Savannah. She described him as generous, attentive, confident, the kind of man who made people feel safe the moment he walked into a room. I remembered how relieved she sounded when she told me he had offered advice about her finances. He had connections, she said, resources, experience. Back then, I had been grateful. A strong, successful man willing to help my daughter when she felt uncertain about her future. Now, standing in the quiet office with property papers spread across my desk, I replayed that memory differently. Victor had asked questions that night. Questions I hadn't thought twice about at the time. How much property does your family still own? He had asked casually while sipping wine at our kitchen table. I had answered without hesitation. Just conversation. Just curiosity. Or so I thought. Now the question echoed in my mind like an accusation. Calculated. Not casual. I closed the folder slowly, pressing my palm against the cover as if that might protect what was inside. The sound of the front doorbell startled me. Sharp. Sudden. I turned toward the shop floor, my pulse quickening. A woman stood just inside the doorway. She wasn't browsing. She wasn't smiling. She looked afraid. Her coat hung loosely around her thin shoulders, the fabric worn at the cuffs. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the strap of her purse. Pale skin, tired eyes, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying something heavy for too long. She stepped forward cautiously. scanning the room as if she expected someone else to be hiding between the display cabinets. "Can I help you?" I asked, forcing calm into my voice. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied my face, her eyes searching, measuring. Then she spoke. "Do you know a man named Victor Hale?" The name hit me like a physical blow. My fingers curled against the counter. "Yes," I answered slowly. "Why?" The woman swallowed, her throat moving visibly. "My daughter trusted him," she said, her voice trembling. "Just like yours." The words hung between us, heavy and suffocating. My heart began pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. She shook her head quickly, as if regretting the words the moment they left her mouth. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered. "You did come," I replied gently. "Please tell me." For a moment, she looked like she might speak. Her lips parted, her hands tightened around her purse. Then she glanced toward the front window. Her expression changed instantly. Fear replaced hesitation. Raw, unmistakable fear. "He doesn't marry," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "He collects—" The phrase didn't make sense at first. "Collects what?" "Money. Trust. Lives." Before I could ask, she stepped backward. "I shouldn't have said anything," she repeated. "Wait," I called, moving toward her. But she was already turning away. Her movements rushed and uneven. The bell above the door rang sharply as she slipped outside into the bright afternoon light. I hurried after her. Stepping onto the sidewalk, she was gone. Not walking down the street. Not standing nearby. Gone. As if she had dissolved into thin air. I stood there for several seconds, scanning the street in confusion, my chest rising and falling too quickly. Then something caught my eye. A white envelope lay just inside the doorway. I didn't remember seeing it before. Slowly, cautiously, I bent down and picked it up. No stamp. No address. No return name. Just a plain envelope. My fingers trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a photograph. I pulled it free, holding it up toward the light streaming through the window. Victor stood in the center of the picture, smiling, dressed in a dark suit. Beside him stood a woman wearing a wedding dress. Not Lauren. Not anyone I recognized. Another bride. Another promise. Another lie. My stomach dropped. I turned the photograph over with shaking hands. On the back, written in uneven ink, were 4 simple words. "You're not the first." And in that moment, standing alone in my shop with that photograph in my hands, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Lauren wasn't special. She wasn't chosen. She was next. I didn't sleep that night. The photograph stayed on the kitchen table long after midnight. The image of Victor standing beside another bride burned into my mind like a scar I couldn't cover. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I saw his smile again, confident, polished, familiar. The same smile he wore when he held Lauren's hand. Except now it meant something different, something colder. The words on the back of the photograph echoed in my thoughts over and over. "You're not the first." I traced the edge of the picture with my fingertips, studying every detail. The suit he wore wasn't one I had seen before. The boutonniere was different. The venue behind him didn't match any church or hall in Savannah that I recognized. Which meant one thing. This wasn't his first life. And Lauren wasn't his first bride. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, I had made up my mind. I couldn't sit still anymore. Fear alone wasn't going to protect my daughter. Action might. I dressed quietly, pulling on a sweater without turning on the overhead lights. The house felt hollow around me, the silence heavy with everything left unsaid between Lauren and me the night before. Before leaving, I checked my phone. A message from Lauren waited on the screen. "Victor says you're overreacting." I stared at the words until they blurred. He knew. Somehow, he already knew I was resisting. That realization sent a sharp pulse of urgency through me. I slipped my phone into my pocket, grabbed my keys, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The streets were quiet as I drove back toward the neighborhood where the frightened woman had appeared the day before. I replayed her face in my mind, the fear in her eyes, the tremor in her hands, the way she had whispered those strange words before disappearing. He doesn't marry. He collects. I parked along the curb near my shop and stepped onto the sidewalk. The same florist stood outside arranging buckets of fresh blooms. The scent of lilies drifted through the air, sweet and soft, completely out of place with the tension tightening my chest. "Excuse me?" I said. Approaching carefully. "Did you happen to see an older woman here yesterday? Thin? Nervous? Maybe wearing a gray coat?" The florist paused, thinking. "Yes," she said slowly. "She comes around sometimes. Lives a few blocks over. I think in that old apartment building near the corner." Hope flickered in my chest. "Thank you," I said quickly. I didn't hesitate. I walked back to my car and followed the directions she had given, my grip tightening on the steering wheel as I turned down unfamiliar streets. The buildings grew older, more worn, paint peeling from window frames and balconies sagging with age. Finally, I spotted the building, a narrow structure with faded brick and narrow windows. I parked and stepped out, my heart pounding harder with every step toward the entrance. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of dust and old carpet. The lighting was dim, flickering slightly overhead. I moved slowly, scanning the numbers painted beside each door until I found the one at the end of the hall. Apartment 3B. I raised my hand and knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. Soft. Hesitant. The door opened just enough for one eye to peer through the gap. Recognition flashed across her face. "You," she whispered. "Yes," I said gently. "Please, I need to talk to you." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she opened the door wider. "Come in," she murmured. The apartment was small and cluttered, boxes stacked along the walls like unfinished memories. A single lamp glowed in the corner, casting long shadows across worn furniture. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said quietly, closing the door behind me. "I'm Margaret," I replied. I reached into my purse and pulled out the photograph, holding it toward her. "Do you know this man?" The moment her eyes landed on Victor's face, the color drained from her cheeks. Her hand rose to her mouth as if to hold back something rising inside her. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the man who destroyed my daughter." The words hit me like a physical blow. Destroyed. Not hurt, not betrayed. Destroyed. I lowered myself into the chair across from her, my knees suddenly weak. "What happened?" I asked. Eleanor sat slowly, her shoulders sagging as though she had carried the weight of this story for far too long. "He came into her life the same way," she began, her voice trembling. "At a charity event, smiling, helpful, generous. He made her feel special." Each word felt like a mirror of Lauren's story. She trusted him. Eleanor continued. "We all did. He helped her reorganize her finances. Said he could make things safer. More stable. Safer. The same word Lauren had used. She signed papers. Eleanor whispered. Documents she didn't fully understand. My stomach tightened. "What happened after that?" I asked carefully. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Her savings disappeared first," she said. "Then the house. Everything she owned, transferred. By the time we realized what he'd done, he was gone. Gone. Vanished. As if he had never existed." I stared at her, the truth settling heavier with each passing second. "He changes names," Eleanor added quietly. "But he never changes his method." A chill ran through me. Different names. Same man. Same trap. I glanced around the apartment, noticing unopened letters stacked along a small table. Financial notices. Bills. Final warnings. Evidence of a life slowly collapsing. My gaze landed on a picture frame lying face down near the edge of the table. Something about it pulled my attention. "May I?" I asked. Eleanor nodded silently. I reached forward and turned the frame upright. My breath caught. Victor stood in the photograph again, but this time beneath a different name printed on a plaque beside him. Daniel Mercer. Not Victor Hale. Another life. Another identity. Before I could speak, the sound of my phone vibrating shattered the silence. Lauren's name lit up the screen. I answered immediately. "Mom?" she said. Her voice tense. "Victor says you've been asking questions." My heart sank. He already knew. "We scheduled another signing tomorrow," she continued. "And this time, I'm going through with it. Tomorrow, too soon. Too fast." As the call ended, I looked back at Eleanor, the photograph still trembling in my hands. Time wasn't slipping away anymore. It was running out. Night had already settled over the house when the knock came. Not a polite tap. Not hesitant. 3 sharp knocks that echoed through the quiet hallway like a warning I had been expecting all day. I froze in the living room. The photograph of Victor, Daniel, still lying on the coffee table where I had dropped it earlier. My heart kicked hard against my ribs as I stood and walked toward the door. I didn't need to check the window to know who it was. Thomas never called before he showed up when things turned serious. I opened the door slowly. He stood there in the dim porch light, wearing a dark jacket instead of his usual suit. His face set in the same expression I remembered from childhood whenever something had gone terribly wrong. Calm. Focused. Unreadable. "Can I come in?" he asked. His voice was quiet. Controlled. I stepped aside without answering. Thomas entered, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. His eyes moved quickly around the room, taking in the photograph on the table, the scattered papers, the tension hanging thick in the air. Without greeting me, without small talk, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the coffee table. A small USB drive. It looked harmless, almost forgettable, but the way he set it down, carefully, deliberately, made my stomach tighten. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Proof," he said. One word, heavy enough to fill the room. I stared at the tiny device, then at him. Proof of what? Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved toward my laptop, opened it, and slid the USB into the port. The soft click sounded louder than it should have. My hands felt cold. A file opened on the screen. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I saw the name. Daniel Mercer. Not Victor Hale. Daniel Mercer. The letters blurred for a second as my mind struggled to process them. "That's not his name," I whispered. "No," Thomas replied. "It's one of them." One of them. The phrase landed like a stone in my chest. Thomas clicked to the next file. Images filled the screen. Driver's licenses. Different states. Different names. Same face. Victor's face. My breath caught. Each photo showed the same confident smile. The same polished appearance. The same calm eyes that had once made me feel reassured. Now they looked different. Colder. Calculated. "How many names?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Enough," Thomas said. "More than you'd expect." He opened another file. This time, photographs of women appeared. Different cities. Different settings. Formal dinners. Outdoor events. Holiday parties. In every image, Victor, Daniel, stood beside a woman, smiling as if he belonged there, as if he was trusted. My stomach twisted. They all trusted him, Thomas said quietly. "That's how he works." I stared at the screen, unable to look away. Faces blurred together, women who looked strong, confident, independent. Women who reminded me of friends, neighbors, even myself. Lauren. The thought struck me so hard I pressed my hand against my chest. "She's not special to him," Thomas continued. "She's targeted. Targeted. Not loved. Not chosen? Chosen for what she had." Thomas clicked again, opening another file filled with legal documents. Property transfers. Ownership changes. Insurance records. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. The formatting looked familiar. Too familiar. These, I whispered, these look like the ones Lauren showed me. Thomas nodded once. That's because they are. A cold wave swept through me. He scrolled down until one document filled the screen. My name appeared at the top. Margaret Doyle. Insurance policy update. I frowned. Confusion creeping in. Why is my insurance here? I asked. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed to a section near the bottom of the page. Beneficiary name. Victor Hale. My breath left me in a sharp rush. I never signed this. I whispered. I know, Thomas replied. My hands trembled as I reached toward the screen, tracing the lines of text that looked official, complete, finalized. Someone had changed my policy. Without permission. Without knowledge. Without consent. Fear shifted inside me, growing sharper. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about control. About ownership. About everything. The front door suddenly opened. I jumped, spinning toward the sound. Lauren stepped inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She stopped short the moment she saw Thomas standing beside the laptop. Her gaze moved from him to the glowing screen, to the documents. What is this? She demanded. Her voice rose instantly, sharp and defensive. You went through his files, she snapped. Stepping closer. I'm trying to protect you, I said. From what? She shot back. From the man I love. Her words cut deeper than fear ever could. Thomas stepped forward calmly. He's not who you think he is, he said. Lauren shook her head immediately. No, she said. You're wrong. He has multiple identities. Thomas continued evenly. Multiple victims. That's ridiculous, Lauren replied. Her voice shaking now, but not with fear. With anger. You always assume the worst about people, she added, turning toward me. Just because you're afraid doesn't mean everyone else should be. I felt something inside me crack. Lauren, I said softly. He changed my insurance policy. Her expression faltered. Just for a second. Then hardened again. He already filed the paperwork today, she said quietly. Everything is moving forward. The words hit me like a punch. Already filed. Already moving. Too fast. Too close. Thomas glanced at me, his expression tightening. We're running out of time, he said. Lauren shook her head again. Backing away. You're trying to destroy my future, she whispered. Then she turned and walked upstairs. The door slammed above us moments later, the sound echoing through the house like thunder. Silence followed. Heavy. Unforgiving. Thomas clicked once more on the laptop. One last thing, he said quietly. I leaned closer, forcing myself to focus despite the pounding in my chest. A calendar entry appeared on the screen. Meeting scheduled. Location. Private law office. Purpose. Final ownership transfer signing. Date. Tomorrow. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. Tomorrow. Not next week. Not someday. Tomorrow. If that meeting happened, everything I owned, everything my husband had left, everything I had built, could vanish in a single signature. And worse than losing property, I might lose my daughter with it. My phone buzzed in my hand before sunrise. I hadn't slept again. The house still carried the silence from the night before, the heavy silence that follows shouting, slammed doors, and words that can't be taken back. I sat at the kitchen table, the laptop still open in front of me, the meeting details glowing on the screen like a ticking clock. Tomorrow. That word had turned into this morning faster than I was ready for. Another buzz. A message from Lauren. We're signing tomorrow morning. My breath caught. Morning. Not afternoon. Not later. Morning. The timeline had shrunk again. My fingers trembled as I reread the message, hoping the words might change if I stared long enough. But they didn't. The final signing was hours away. Not days. Not even one full day. Hours. I pressed my hand flat against the table. grounding myself against the sudden rush of panic threatening to swallow me whole. Panic wouldn't help. Fear wouldn't help. Only action might. I tapped Lauren's name and called her. The phone rang twice. 3 times. Then her voice answered, tight and guarded. "What?" she said. No greeting. No warmth. Just tension. "We need to talk," I said immediately. "Face to face." "We already talked," she replied. "You made your opinion clear." "This isn't about opinions," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "This is about your future." Silence filled the line. Then another voice entered the background. Victor. Even through the phone. I recognized the smooth confidence in his tone. "We can explain everything tomorrow," he said calmly. "There's no need to panic tonight." My stomach twisted. He had stepped into the conversation without invitation, without hesitation. "I'm not panicking," I said carefully. "I'm asking for clarity." "Then come over," Victor replied. "We're home." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone in my hand, the weight of his voice still lingering in my ears. He hadn't sounded nervous. He hadn't sounded threatened. He had sounded confident. Too confident. I grabbed my keys and left the house before doubt could take hold again. The drive to Lauren's place felt longer than usual. Every red light lasted too long. Every passing car seemed to slow me down. My grip tightened around the steering wheel as the sky outside shifted from black to gray. When I finally pulled into the driveway, both their cars were already there, waiting, like they had been expecting me. I stepped out slowly, forcing myself to breathe as I approached the front door. Before I could knock, it opened. Victor stood there, smiling, but not warmly. Not the way he used to smile at family dinners or birthday celebrations. This smile was thinner, controlled. "You made good time," he said smoothly. His tone was polite. Too polite. Lauren stood behind him in the living room, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her expression was guarded, her eyes tired, but still defiant. I stepped inside. The house felt unnaturally quiet. No television. No music. No distractions. Just the 3 of us, and the truth hovering between us like smoke. I reached into my purse and pulled out the photograph, the one with the bride who wasn't my daughter. I held it out. Victor looked down at it. For a moment, he said nothing. No denial. No confusion. Just silence. "That was a long time ago," he said finally. "Not that isn't me. Not, I don't know what you're talking about." That was a long time ago. My heart dropped into my stomach. "How many women?" I asked quietly. Victor gave a small, almost amused smile. "That question doesn't matter," he replied. It mattered to me. It mattered more than anything. Lauren shifted beside him, her voice breaking into the tension. "What is this about?" she demanded. "This is about patterns," I said. "About lies." Victor's eyes moved toward me again. Colder now. "You should thank me," he said calmly. "Your daughter has never been safer financially." The words chilled me. Safer. He said it like ownership, like control. Lauren stepped forward, her voice rising. "You're attacking him again," she snapped. "You're destroying everything we've built." "Built?" The word echoed painfully. "I'm trying to protect you," I said, my voice shaking now. "You're trying to control me," she shot back. The accusation hit harder than anything Victor had said. "You don't understand," I whispered. "No?" she replied sharply. "You don't understand?" She turned toward Victor. "We already signed preliminary papers," she added firmly. "Everything is moving forward." My vision blurred. Preliminary papers. Already signed. Already processed. The damage had begun. Without thinking, I pulled out my phone and dialed Thomas. "Right there." In front of Victor. In front of Lauren. Victor's expression shifted slightly. Just a flicker. Barely visible. But real. Thomas answered immediately. "Location," he said. I gave him the address. Names. Details. Everything. If he's pushing signatures this fast, Thomas said through the speaker, he's preparing to disappear. Disappear. The word echoed like thunder in my chest. Victor stepped closer to the door, gesturing subtly. I think it's time you left, he said calmly. His tone had changed. No warmth. No politeness. Just quiet authority. I walked toward the door slowly. My heart beat loud in my ears. Victor followed me. Alone. Lauren stayed behind. When we reached the doorway, Victor leaned slightly closer. Close enough that his voice wouldn't carry into the room. You should trust your daughter, he said softly. Not your fears. His words sounded gentle. But the tone underneath them wasn't. It carried warning. Cold and deliberate. People who panic, he added quietly, lose everything faster. My chest tightened. Not reassurance. A threat. I stepped outside into the morning air, my lungs finally pulling in a full breath. The sky had turned pale gray, heavy with clouds that hadn't yet broken into rain. By the time I reached home, exhaustion hit me like a wave. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, letting my body sag for the first time since sunrise. Fear settled into my bones. Not loud, not dramatic, just deep. I walked slowly to the office safe and opened it. Inside lay the original property deeds, insurance records, documents my husband had signed years before he died. Our history, our legacy, everything at risk. My phone buzzed again. An email notification. From Victor. My hands trembled as I opened it. Subject line. Final authorization copy. I tapped the attachment. The document opened instantly. Prepared. Complete. Waiting. Ready to sign? Tomorrow morning. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together as realization hit me with crushing clarity. The trap wasn't coming. It had already been built. And if I didn't stop it, by tomorrow, everything could be gone. Morning light spilled across the kitchen table, but I hadn't touched the coffee in front of me. It sat there growing cold while papers spread across the surface like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. My hands rested flat against the wood, fingers stiff, heart still pounding from the email Victor had sent the night before. Final authorization copy. The words felt like a threat disguised as paperwork. Thomas sat across from me, leaning slightly forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His face looked sharper than usual in the early light. More focused, less like my brother, and more like the man he had become through years of work I barely understood. He expects you to panic, Thomas said quietly. I looked up at him. He expects fear, he continued. People like him depend on it. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay still. What happens if I do panic? I asked. Thomas met my gaze steadily. Then he wins. The simplicity of that answer hit me harder than anything else he'd said. Win. Lose. That was how Victor saw this. Not as love, not as family, as a game. And if I don't panic? I asked. Thomas leaned back slightly. Then we make him believe he's winning, he said. The words settled into my mind slowly, forming something new, something unfamiliar. Not fear. Strategy. How? I whispered. You cooperate, Thomas said. You smile. You agree. You let him think he has control. The idea made my stomach twist. Pretend to trust the man who had nearly destroyed us. Pretend to hand over everything. What if he suspects something? I asked. Then we make sure he doesn't. Thomas replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, sliding it across the table toward me. Federal attorneys are already involved, he added. They're waiting for proof, not suspicion. Proof. The word echoed in my mind. Proof. Not fear, not guesses. Proof. I picked up my phone slowly, staring at Lauren's name on the screen. Calling her felt like stepping into dangerous water. Still, I pressed the button. The phone rang once. Twice. Then her voice answered. Hello? Her tone was cautious. Guarded. I forced calm into my voice. I was wrong. I said quietly. Silence filled the line. I overreacted. I continued. I let fear get the better of me. The words tasted bitter, but I pushed them out anyway. Lauren exhaled slowly. I told Victor you'd come around, she said, her voice softening slightly. Victor. Even now. His name carried weight between us. I just want us to move forward, I said carefully. Together. Another pause. Then Lauren spoke again. He'll be relieved to hear that, she said. Relieved. The word tightened something inside my chest. Victor feared resistance, not cooperation. Tell him I'm ready to finish the paperwork, I added. Lauren sounded almost hopeful when she answered. We scheduled the signing this morning, she said. At a private law office downtown. My pulse quickened. Private. Controlled. His environment. Thomas watched me carefully as I ended the call. He'll expect everything to go smoothly, Thomas said. That's our advantage. I nodded slowly, though fear still flickered in my chest. What happens once we get there? I asked. Thomas's expression hardened. We wait, he said. We listen. And we let him talk. Talk. That sounded simple. Too simple. But I trusted my brother. More than I trusted fear. The law office stood tall and quiet against the morning sky, its glass doors reflecting the gray clouds above. My hands trembled slightly as I stepped inside, the smell of polished floors and fresh paper filling the air. Victor was already there. Of course he was. He stood beside Lauren near the conference table, dressed in a tailored suit that made him look calm and confident, like a man who believed the future belonged to him. Lauren smiled when she saw me. Not fully. Not warmly. But hopeful. I knew you'd come around, Victor said smoothly. His voice carried the same polished confidence that had once reassured me. Now it sounded rehearsed. Calculated. I forced a small smile. I just want what's best for Lauren, I replied. Victor nodded. Satisfied. A folder sat neatly in front of him. Thick. Prepared. Waiting. Too prepared. Lauren took her seat beside him. I sat across from them, my hands resting in my lap to hide the trembling. The lawyer entered moments later, greeting us with professional politeness. He opened the folder and began reviewing the documents in careful, technical language, legal terms, ownership clauses, transfer authority. Victor listened with patience, though I noticed the slight tightening of his jaw each time the explanation slowed. He wanted speed, not caution. I leaned forward slightly. Once this is signed, I asked carefully, everything transfers to you, correct? Victor turned toward me, smiling again. Yes, he said confidently. It simplifies everything once your name is removed. Silence followed. A heavy, dangerous silence. Removed. That was the word. Not protected. Not secured. Removed. Before anyone could speak again, the door behind us opened. 2 men stepped inside. Dark suits. Serious faces. Authority in every movement. Victor stiffened instantly. What is this? He demanded. Thomas entered behind them. Not as my brother. As an agent. His voice came out calm and steady. Everything you just said has been recorded, he announced. Victor's face changed. Confidence cracked. Anger surged. Lauren gasped softly beside him, her eyes darting from Victor to Thomas and back again. You set me up, Victor snapped. Thomas didn't flinch. You exposed yourself, he replied. Victor's jaw tightened. You have no idea what you've started, he growled. Lauren turned toward him, her voice shaking. Is any of this true? She whispered. Victor said nothing. Not denial. Not explanation. Silence. And in that silence, Lauren's face broke. Tears filled her eyes as realization settled over her like a storm. Trust shattered. Love replaced by truth. I watched her crumble, my own heart breaking alongside hers. Victor struggled against the agents now restraining him, his voice sharp with fury. This isn't over, he whispered as they led him toward the door. His eyes locked onto mine. cold, threatening, even restrained. He carried danger. As the door closed behind him, the room fell into stunned silence. Victory had come, but relief didn't feel like celebration. It felt like survival. And standing there beside my daughter, watching her world collapse into truth, I realized something I hadn't expected. Saving her had cost us more than I ever imagined. The room felt strangely quiet after they took him away. The door had closed behind Victor, but the echo of his final words still lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Papers lay scattered across the conference table, chairs slightly out of place, as if the room itself had been shaken by the truth that had just unfolded. Lauren stood beside me, motionless. Her hands trembled at her sides, fingers curled tightly as if she were holding on to something invisible. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door where Victor had disappeared, as though part of her still expected him to walk back in and tell us all it had been some terrible misunderstanding. But no one came back. No one corrected the truth. Only silence remained. I watched her carefully, unsure whether to speak or simply wait. Sometimes pain needed space before it could turn into understanding. Was any of it real? She whispered at last. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. Not angry. Not defensive. Just broken. Thomas stepped forward slightly, his expression softer now than it had been moments earlier. Some feelings can be real, he said quietly. But the intentions behind them weren't. Lauren closed her eyes. For a moment, I thought she might collapse. Instead, she inhaled slowly, like someone forcing air into lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. The conference room door opened again, and Eleanor stepped inside. I hadn't expected to see her there. She moved carefully, her posture still fragile but steadier than before. Her eyes met Lauren's, not with anger, but with something deeper. Understanding. Pain shared across time. Lauren stared at her, confusion flickering across her face. "This is Eleanor," I said gently. She tried to warn me. Eleanor nodded once. "My daughter trusted him too," she said softly. Lauren swallowed hard. The words seemed to land differently this time, not as accusations, but as truth. He told her everything would be safe. Eleanor continued, that he was protecting her future. The same words, the same promises. Lauren's shoulders began to shake. "And then?" Lauren asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated, her voice tightening. "She lost everything," she said. "Savings, home, stability, all of it signed away piece by piece." Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. Lauren pressed her hand against her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I almost became her," she whispered. The realization hit all of us at once. Not someday, not eventually. Almost. That single word held more weight than anything else spoken that morning. Later that evening, the house felt unfamiliar in its stillness. Lauren sat at the kitchen table, the same seat where I had spent so many sleepless nights worrying about her future. The overhead light cast a soft glow across her face, highlighting the exhaustion etched into her features. I stood in the doorway for a moment before walking in. She didn't look up immediately. Her fingers traced the edge of the table, slow and distracted, like she was searching for something steady. "I should have listened to you," she said quietly. Her voice cracked on the final word. Not dramatic, not loud, just honest. I sat down beside her. "I should have trusted my instincts sooner," I replied softly. She turned toward me, her eyes red and swollen. "I thought he loved me," she whispered. The pain in her voice cut deeper than anything else we had endured. I reached across the table and took her hand. Not to lecture, not to remind her she had been wrong, just to hold her there in the silence that followed. "I almost signed everything," she admitted after a moment. "The final papers were ready." A chill ran through me. "How close?" I asked carefully. Lauren lowered her gaze. "Hours," she whispered. "Hours." That was all that had stood between us and losing everything. Days later, Thomas returned with updates. We sat in my living room, The same place where he had first placed the USB on the table. The tension felt different now, lighter, but not completely gone. They've connected him to multiple cases, Thomas said. Different states, different identities. I listened quietly, absorbing each detail. He targeted families with assets. Thomas continued. Especially women who trusted easily. Lauren sat beside me, silent but attentive. Several families have already come forward, he added. Your report helped stop him before he moved again. I hadn't expected that. Not recognition. Not gratitude. Just survival. Still, hearing those words shifted something inside me. What we had done mattered beyond our own home. A few mornings later, I returned to the antique shop. Sunlight poured through the front windows, warming the wooden floors and casting long shadows across the glass cabinets. The familiar ticking of the clocks filled the space again, steady, rhythmic, comforting. For the first time in weeks, the sound didn't feel like a countdown. It felt like stability. I ran my fingers across the edge of the display counter, grounding myself in the quiet familiarity of the place. Moments later, the door chimed softly. Lauren stepped inside. She looked different. Not weaker. Not broken. Just more aware. More careful. She walked slowly toward the counter, her movements thoughtful. I want to help fix everything, she said quietly. The paperwork. The records. All of it. I studied her face. There was no blind trust left there. Only caution. Growth. I nodded once. We'll fix it together, I replied. That word, together, felt stronger now than it ever had before. That evening, we shared a small dinner at home. Nothing fancy. No celebration. Just quiet conversation and the gentle clink of dishes. The tension that had once filled the room had softened into something calmer, something steadier. Lauren reached across the table at one point, touching my hand. Thank you, she said softly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just sincerely. I squeezed her fingers gently, understanding more in that moment than words could ever express. Later that night, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I thought back to the moment that had started everything. Thomas's whisper, soft, barely audible. Don't sign anything he gives you. Those few words had changed the course of our lives. Sometimes warnings don't come loudly. Sometimes they arrive as quiet instincts, subtle fears, or the uneasy feeling that something isn't right, even when everyone else seems convinced that everything is perfect. I learned that listening to those warnings can mean the difference between losing everything and saving the people you love most. And if you've ever had a moment when something inside you whispered that danger was closer than it seemed, I hope you listened. If this story reminded you of a time when your instincts protected you, or when someone you loved tried to warn you, I'd truly love to hear about it. Share your story in the comments. And stay with us for more real-life stories about family, trust, and survival. Because sometimes, the quietest warnings are the ones that save us.